Well, hello and welcome to this session of World City, where we're looking at the innovative city. I'm joined by Emma Frost, who's a director of Shift, London's Living Lab, and she's also chair of the United Kingdom's Innovation Districts Group. I'm also joined by Dr. Tim Moonen, who's the managing director of the Business of Cities, working with more than 100 cities around the world on their relationship and their strategies for the innovation economy. Welcome, Emma. Welcome, Tim.
Hi.
Thank you, Greg.
Let's start, if we may, with you, Tim, looking at the broadest possible picture here. What would you say are the characteristics of cities that have been able to grow, attract, and retain innovation economy advantages? What is it that makes those cities winners?
Well, what a question to kick off, Greg. Thank you. I guess the way I would tend to answer that is thinking about the international picture the last 30, 40 years, right? We've got cities of very different kinds and origins that have been succeeding. We might say that in the 90s, it was the regional R&D capitals, the Tel Avivs, the Bostons, the Munichs that were really succeeding. And then as the digital industry started to mature, you had Shenzhen and Bangalore and Seattle and many others. And then after the global financial crisis, a whole host of other cities began to understand the recipe. It was Amsterdam and Seoul and Singapore, cities that had struggled to really manage to do this in the past, that began to work it out. And I think the reason that you see very different kinds of cities, even among just that group, is because the industries and the technologies that innovation thrives on are evolving all of the time, aren't they? There's a different set of industries. It was the finance and media and digital sectors. Then it became certain sectors, perhaps life sciences and gaming, creative industries. Now you see urban services and new kind of transport technologies very much to the fore. Those industries need something different, don't they? They need different capabilities, different spaces, different ecosystems in which they thrive. So you've got that going on, a whole host of ways in which globalization is changing and capital and the behavior of capital changes. So different cities realize there's a recipe and that they can get involved. But I would say if you had to ask me what were the common ingredients, I'd say there are four. I think firstly, there's the fundamentals. Then it's really about what I would call the personality and the policy and increasingly, and we'll get into this later, the place. So those four factors, what do I mean by that? I think the fundamentals are really, a city needs a growing population, it needs labor mobility, it needs to be open, it needs to somehow respond to changing demographics and be able to continually diversify the mix of people who can take part in that economy. It needs strategic location, doesn't it? It needs the resources, whether those in some cases are much more reliant on natural, in other cases it's the human or it's the energy resources, but it needs to be able to tap into those consistently. It needs one or two, I think, tradable growth sectors that really do have some critical mass and a range of companies and some degree of competitive pressure to innovate. And then it's going to need the knowledge institutions usually that are producing IP formally and informally and are bringing forward a talent base for the future. Those are the fundamentals. And we often talk to cities around the world that actually you've got to really work on those fundamentals in many cases and foster those over a long period of time before you should start thinking about a fully fledged innovation strategy or an innovation place approach. So work on those fundamentals. But then there's those three other things. Personality. There's a common set of interesting cultures, aren't they, about the cities I mentioned. They've got a certain kind of mindset or attitude that's favoring an appetite for risk, an enjoyment almost of that friction of collaboration, a certain persevering spirit, a grit, and some of that to do with the unique origins of those places. But actually, I think also cities work out how to foster that. Certain key agents of change begin to bring that out a bit more, and how the personalities of cities, I think, evolve is very interesting to me. And then the other two factors, policy and place, I think increasingly to the fore. Policy being much more about the regulatory and the business environment that an innovation economy is going to need. It's about the leadership and the ability to think long term and to work with neighbours as well as your immediate geography, and also think about what's your brand and identity, and then what's the policy role in all of that to support innovation. So cities can work on those, and then we're going to get into this a lot more, but the place dimension, which is of course the fact that innovation economies are fundamentally much more place sensitive than they used to be. They need a different sense of how they connect into like-minded firms, but also different global markets, and spaces at a very granular level, but also at a sort of meso and macro level that they need curated for them. So there's a strong whole sense of questions that we'll get into about land uses and quality of place and openness and porosity that's so interesting. But I think when you look at those four factors, then actually cities are working out, actually we can build those and work on those. The way we tend to look at it in our work is that you've got pretty mature innovation economies now, about 20 or 30 of them. And then you've got this sort of second tier of 100, 150 cities that have got some of those core ingredients, but are working out how to scale it or how to focus and maybe develop some more visibility. And then there's, you know, hundreds of others, perhaps even 1,000 cities around the world that have really got some ambition. So it's an exciting time. And I think it's allowing us to think, how can you help cities work on the fundamentals, but also think about the place as well.
God, Tim, this is absolutely fascinating. And listening to you with the hundreds of cities literally that you work with around the world, I think you've said very clearly it's personality, it's policy, and it's place. But those things are all underpinned by the fundamentals of what you need to do to host an innovation economy, in particular, talking about the openness, the intellectual property, the knowledge base, and the entrepreneurship approach. And I can't wait to hear Emma talking about this in a minute. But I must ask you another question first, Tim, because I sense that sometimes there's a bit of a confusion in the way this debate happens. We're talking here about the innovative city. Of course, one version of being an innovative city is that you have an innovation economy. You're hosting those high-value, knowledge-rich industries. Another version of being an innovative city is that you're a champion of urban innovation. You're doing something to change the way the city looks and feels and operates. So is there a connection between these two things? Do the cities that are more innovative in their urban systems end up hosting more of the innovation economy? Or are the cities that have more of the innovation economy compelled then to innovate in their urban system? Is there a causal relationship or is it a casual relationship?
I like that idea, and I think that the answer is not always. I would say it's been a mystery in a certain sense that you've got these world-class innovation economies that have been evolving around the world, but actually have they translated that into a really compelling urban and metropolitan platform and infrastructure? And not always, and in fact not often, would be the answer so far. And equally, you've got those cities that have been pioneering a host of urban innovations and technologies. Think of Dubai, or pioneering certain sorts of urban transformations like Vienna and its affordable housing and models and things like that, that haven't also yet found a way to translate those sorts of initiatives into a self-sustaining ecosystem of frontier companies that produce, you know, a lot of jobs and a lot of IP and a lot of value for the city. So squaring that circle is something more and more cities are trying to figure out, because actually there is an obvious set of relationships. If you've got a city that's able to really bring forward improvements in quality of life, or really start to make it easy through technology for things to set up, businesses should become more efficient. You should be able to create better citizen services. You should be able to unlock the data platforms that were hidden away. You should be able to identify the public assets and the public land that you want to really utilize in a way that is much more effective, and in return therefore generate an equilibrium there between the urban innovations you're looking for and the innovative companies. Equally, you've got in a system when you've already got a lot of innovation happening in terms of the enterprise economy, that should be producing the apps and the solutions and the certain applications that you could then be applied to the local environment. And that hasn't materialized in those examples I mentioned so much, but it is happening in certain cases. I look at Stockholm, for example, and see the way that its investments in dark fiber infrastructure, its recent more investment in sensors and lighting for improved safety. Obviously, it's work on childcare and gender reforms that make things much easier for the talent base and the entrepreneurship to be much more diversified. That's actually helped to really imbue not just the digital companies that we all know about, the Skypes and the Klarnas and all the others, but actually the social impact companies that have been growing. And the whole cluster of leading social impact institutions and companies that are growing out of that. And I'd also observe, thinking about Asia, Taipei is quite an interesting model of how the advanced industries in heavy and light industries and the knowledge sectors have started to apply a lot of their innovations to the metropolitan transformation that really is pretty amazing in Taipei and its surrounding ecosystem. So you can see it happen. And I think it's going to mean a lot more integrated way of thinking between the place, the innovation, and then the inclusion and the social dimension of change, which I think we'll talk about more.
Tim, thank you very much. A brilliant answer to, I think, quite a thorny question. And what I heard you say is that the innovation economy can exist in a city. A city can be innovative in terms of its urban systems, but they don't necessarily require one another. It's just that if you have both, they can enrich and accelerate one another, and it might require a bit of intentionality. Now, Emma, you're the director of London's leading innovation district, and you're also the chair of the UK's Innovation Districts Group. So give us your response to this question. Are the cities that have an innovation economy also the ones that are most innovative in terms of their urban systems?
As you say, it's such a thorny question. I think Tim outlined some answers really well there. I don't think there is necessarily a direct link or causality between them, but there's so much that needs to be unpacked because there's clearly an interrelationship between innovation economies and urban innovation centres. And part of that, and part of the reason why that's often changing over time, as Tim outlined, is because one of the connections is more to do with the layers of learning and cultural absorption over time. If we think about how places over the years have had to respond to change and challenge, that's often developed innovative urban solutions. And this sort of place-based knowledge seeps into the water and builds a certain kind of innovation mindset and a capacity that then can stimulate more innovation economies. And I'd offer just two examples to sort of bring that to life. One from a very long time ago, if we think about Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So all of Amsterdam lies below sea level, and the draining of the bogland and the creation of the seawall and flood defences back in the 1700s required different farmers and landowners to cooperate and form trusted partnerships because they needed to maintain this continuous line of seawall defence. And that laid the foundation for a new type of shared risk business model, which then went on to form the basis of the joint stock company. And that's actually the origin of what we call a company limited by guarantee today. So you start to see how the ability to form a shared risk and limited risk business was one of the reasons that the Netherlands then excelled in early global trade markets. And from there, that helped them develop much more innovative economies. So we can see the links there between a city's response to a challenge and how that can really help shape its ability to innovate. And I think a second, much more recent example that I'd offer is actually on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London. And here it was the hosting of the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games that rekindled the confidence and purpose of that place that had actually been dormant for some time. So it was an area with long history of innovation and invention, right back from the Industrial Revolution. It was the birthplace of plastic, paint dyes, and the women's workers' trade movement. But it took the hosting of the 2012 Games, and specifically the world's most sustainable games, to reignite that confidence and that mindset. So features like designing demountable temporary venues that could be transported elsewhere and used again, creating the UK's largest district energy network to power the whole area, and designing the lowest steel content stadium. These things really raise the bar in terms of sustainable urban design and urban innovation. And again, we see how that urban innovation has gone on to stimulate innovative economies, so much so that now on the Olympic Park, we see a real R&D intensity with 6 different universities located immediately on the park and increasingly working together. We see Plexel, the UK's largest innovation centre and co-working space, with over 800 businesses based there. We see modern methods of construction being tested and developed. We see a large e-gaming cluster emerging on the park and a whole new cultural and education quarter with global names like the V&A, BBC and Sadler's Wells, testing really innovative dimensions of what does the next form of theatre production and cultural consumption look like. And in fact, just last year, the park launched as an inclusive innovation district under the banner of Shift to create a real-world urban testbed with the sole purpose of supporting innovation on health in cities, movement in cities and climate resilience in cities, because that speaks to the point that we were just talking about. We need to find more of those sweet spots between mission-led innovation. How can you unite those innovation economies with the urban innovation challenges and needs that we so desperately need to address? So really being able to prototype and test with iterative learning and rapid proof of concept work in a real world urban testbed is so important if we're going to make these seismic shifts on the things that are mattering most to every day.
Emma, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And, in a way, you've said two very powerful things that I heard. Firstly, Shift, the place where you are director, is one of, not just one of London's most innovative innovation districts, but it's also a perfect example of what you're describing. It is both hosting an innovation economy, and also it is experimenting and pioneering in all sorts of urban systems that will change the fabric of the place, the people's experience of it, and indeed provide the platform upon which all of these new industries can emerge. So that's pretty fascinating. I'm sure our audience will want to come and visit. But the other thing you've said really importantly is that history reveals something. And history reveals, it seems to me from what you're saying, that there is a connection over time between the places that innovate in terms of their urban systems, their placemaking and everything else, and the places that eventually start to produce other kinds of innovations that may be more economic in their content. So thank you for that. Now, Emma, stay on the microphone, please, because this begs another big question, doesn't it? Which is that there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of ideas around that somehow placemaking, urban design, architecture, the physical fabric of a district is somehow part of this ability both to host the innovation economy, but also to be a place of experimentation in urban living and urban systems. So to what extent do you think that's really true? How important is placemaking and urban design in forging that connection?
I would say that placemaking is more and more an essential part of this connection. But it wasn't necessarily always the case. So across the world, we can see very different roles that placemaking has played in different innovation economies. And I'd go as far as to say that in some cases, innovation clusters were almost place agnostic or place unconscious. We have to look at places like North Carolina or Ann Arbor in Michigan or Seattle. But increasingly, they've had to become more place conscious. And other places are now trying to kickstart their innovation economy specifically through place. So again, if we think about sites in UAE or, as Tim mentioned before, Seoul in South Korea, and in the UK, particularly places like Belfast Harbour and Glasgow and the Cambridge cluster, place is really an essential part of their mix and their proposition. But I think it's also important that we unpack placemaking a little bit. So in simple terms, I like to think there are kind of two sides to placemaking. There's the physical side, as you mentioned, but there's also the social side. So on the physical side, we're talking about things like infrastructure, real estate, urban design, public realm management. On the social, it's more about the activation and the events, the network building, the place branding and the place narrative. And if you get those two elements right, you can really maximize your economic output. Now, obviously, it's not as simple as that, and there's always more nuance, and we need to understand the interrelationship between the physical and the social dimensions. So just to dig into a couple of examples there, let's think about the role of design on shaping how we feel and act in places. Colin Ellard has done some really great research that indicates boring and monotonous cityscapes actually increase sadness, addiction, and disease-related stress. So I guess, is the opposite true? Can architectural variation really stimulate a different kind of output and outcome in people? Does it create more engaging places? Can we help create more healing places, a lot like Maggie's cancer centres have sought to do? And can we do more innovative places in the way that we design and manage spaces? And that's a lot of what we see inside collaboration spaces now. But there's also a thought around what's the importance of human scale and how you get a human connection between the spaces, the visibility of what's going on inside. And for that, I often think about the importance of the ground floor activation and the uses. They really help create welcoming buildings, kind of friendly forces. They can reduce the sometimes intimidating, closed, often exclusive or restricted feel that a lot of research or even learning spaces can have. And those ground floor uses play a really important part in eroding the barriers, both real and perceived, between an innovation community and a surrounding community, making them more one local community. I always remember the story in Liverpool when they opened the new Spine building in 2021. The ground floor reception area, when that opened, the facilities management team noticed a massive increase in fingerprints and sticky marks on the windows because people had been coming right up to get a glimpse of what was going inside this big striking building. And I just love that idea that sticky fingers might somehow be a success indicator. And in fact, Tim and I are just starting some work together on how we value and measure innovation districts. So maybe sticky fingers is a metric that we should consider. Another element that I think is worthy of sort of really better understanding is meanwhile spaces and interim uses and how they can be part of place activation and brand building, and the role that they play in community engagement often as well. And we found this on the Olympic Park with Hackney Bridge, which is one of our meanwhile use sites. For 12 years, we have an interim use there that was co-designed with local community. And the whole ethos behind that was to try and create an entry-level space for freelancers, independents, and micro businesses, with a view to actually providing space where they could then scale up, and follow-on space where they could stay as part of the permanent development that was coming 8 to 12 years later. So there's a real thought that needs to go into how you program the changing nature of spaces and how you involve people in that process. And that sort of speaks to flexibility in general about urban composition, which is something we need to be facing into a lot more. So how do we build in flexibility, both in terms of building types, volumes, uses, locations, and open spaces? Because resilient places are going to need to respond to rapidly changing market demands, new and emerging sectors, and also climate impacts. And we only have to look at COVID and the experience over those 2.5 years to see the change of the demand profile on things like wet and dry lab space, or for grade A office space and large HQ centres, and the demand for digital connectivity, both inside buildings and outside of buildings. So already we can see that demands do fluctuate quite rapidly now. And we need to have a planning system and a policy system that's able to accommodate those changes, and think more about change of uses in a proactive way, and reuse of materials and reuse of buildings. And that requires innovation in the planning and the policy space, not just in terms of the activity that takes place inside the buildings. And generally, I think that also kind of draws us to a bigger question, if you like, which is the wider role of the innovation economy in the relationship with climate change. If innovation is about responding effectively to a change in situation or needs, well, we have a pretty massive need now with the climate crisis. And in that sense, I think we really need to think about how we utilize the innovation economy to accelerate decarbonisation across all industries and across all verticals in the system, from rethinking production and consumption, supply and distribution chains, the circular economy, and new types of business models that aren't fully conceived yet. So innovation has a big role to play in terms of how we rethink economic systems in response to decarbonisation. And a big part of that is understanding those really delicate and detailed dynamics of placemaking, and how you need both the physical and the social to really work in tandem to maximise the sort of diversity and interface of activity that happens inside these dense cluster spaces.
My goodness, Emma, this is like a masterclass on the whole topic. And I think I heard you say 4 things. I just want to summarize very quickly. 1, you said, yes, placemaking is very, very, very important. 2, it's not just important in terms of physical placemaking, it's actually the community building part. It's the social, the human, the health, the well-being part. 3, you said, meanwhile uses, tactical urbanism, agility, those are very important parts of placemaking, that you build in the capacity for change and adaptation. And 4, I think you said, therefore, these kinds of places and the innovation economies that they host are absolutely critical to tackling the climate emergency, because they provide the basis for breakthroughs, for difference, for, giving up old path dependencies, moving into new modes and models, inspiring citizens to change their behavior. Absolutely fantastic. Tim, have you anything to add?
Well, what else is there to add? But I guess, I would just observe that the journey Emma's been talking about, that the UK and its innovation districts and its cities and city regions has echoes in what we see elsewhere. And, I'm really excited going around the world as I do, seeing countries that were relatively, as Emma said, place unconscious, becoming much more aware of what's needed and adopting more of the tools that are required. I would say, look at Australia, for example. That's a country whose states and state governments have really embraced the notion of place and incorporated that into how they begin to organise. Because, of course, place is an integrator, and it requires integrated approaches. So thinking about the role that certain precincts can play as sort of flagships and catalysts of a whole new way of working and delivering full spectrum places, I think is very exciting. And we see that happening in Australia. You see in cities, particularly those that have got a lot of, inherited competence and capability, city governments, they're beginning to also understand that place is not something you impose, but something you foster from the bottom up. I think it's very striking that, if you look at somewhere like Barcelona or somewhere like Oslo, you've got examples there with the 22 Act district, and many of you will be familiar with that location, the post-industrial poster child of the European innovation system in a way. That location in Barcelona has evolved from being something where there was a lot of public intervention and a lot of place shaping into a really strong bottom-up network of institutions and SMEs, and working hard to think about what it needs, soft as well as hard support. And then, in Oslo, with Oslo Science City, you've got a location there where the leaders are really recognizing that it's about fostering the relationships that operate at the leadership, but also the sub-leadership levels that really galvanize and make sure that a big place transformation is actually going to translate into real ownership, because that's one of the things that you see missing in certain transformation efforts, a lack of ownership from the key players in the district. And so understanding that networking dimension, and even in locations around the world where we've done some close work to look at how universities can start to foster this. Say in Johannesburg, you see examples where place activation, that's both improvements of the public realm, but also, how do you create an environment that different sorts of people can feel welcome and feel able to do innovative work. That's something that you see happening in Johannesburg, for example, and other cities we've worked in. So some great changes happening. And I would just say it's going to keep happening, because the fundamental reality is for nearly all of the cities we see is that digitization is forcing them to think, actually, as a place, we've got some competition, not just from other locations, but the online marketplace, as it were, and they've got to perform better and be more magnetic. Climate change, exactly in the way Emma says, forcing an integrated and multi-system, multi-sector set of approaches. And then, of course, the inequalities we see in our cities are raising the prospect and raising the reality that we see around us, that not enough places, including innovation districts, are sufficiently magnetic, sufficiently collaborative, sufficiently appealing and open to all the right sorts of people, the whole mix of people. So there is a real set of drivers that I think is going to mean that place management, place leadership, and placemaking are sort of going to become this sort of new agenda, new art that's going to require a lot of skills. And it's an exciting time. And I think it's going to be one of the major elements of how the leadership of cities is going to be shaped in the next 10 years at least.
Tim, thank you very much. I mean, this is music to my ears. I think that we've known for a long time somehow that place matters in the way economies perform, in the way communities cohere, in the way we can be intentional about implementing policy. But I think what Emma and yourself have just described is, in a sense, the perfect thesis about how place is an active ingredient in tackling these big challenges, rather than just a passive location. And it seems to me that you really said something important there. Now, Emma, staying with this, I want to talk to you about this idea of innovation districts, because after all, you are the chair of the UK's Innovation Districts Group. And I suppose I want to say, on one level, of course, innovation districts are very, very interesting places that we should all be placing attention on. But is there a kind of risk here that we get, as it were, preoccupied with the idea of a singular space? I mean, is the idea of an innovation district the solution, or does it go sort of beyond one neighborhood or cluster of neighborhoods, one precinct? I mean, what do cities need to do to bring together the stakeholders and the actors, not just to focus on one district, but to get, in the end, an innovation-rich city that is innovative in every part of the city? Can you speak to that? Is it innovation districts or innovative cities that we really want? And how do they relate?
Yeah, it's a really big and a really good question. I think the first thing to say is I think innovation districts aren't the whole solution, but they're an important part of it. And we should really unpack that there are lots of different types of innovation cluster models. It's definitely not a one size fits all. So even if we just look at a few different international examples, thinking about the likes of Tel Aviv, which isn't so much an innovation district focus and more of a whole city approach, it sort of conceptualizes the whole city as an innovation magnet. If you look somewhere like Glasgow, they've actually got 3 different innovation districts that are quite qualified and quite identified, and they're doing a lot of work right now to understand how they can link them better together through shared policy programs and initiatives like the Cities Innovation Accelerator. Then we look at places like Singapore, which started with One North in Singapore and is now expanding off the back of that success to other parts of the city. And then you look at somewhere like Amsterdam, which has actually a huge concentration of micro innovation districts, up to about 20 or 30 kind of mini campuses across the city, all very tightly connected. So even within that, we can see there are different typologies of innovation districts. It's not a cookie cutter style approach. But I think it is important to understand why an innovation district, that sort of human scale, is quite important. And the first thing I'd pull out is there's an element of understanding the geographies of trust. So it's this notion that a district provides a manageable human scale for relationship building, for visibility, for experimentation and cross-pollination. And all of those things help build like a network of trust embedded in a place. And that can't happen at an overly massive scale, because people do have geographies of trust. Like, we do work in proximity that then helps breed familiarity, which can breed increased trust. So having something that feels more manageable, and something that responds to proximity as a prerequisite for innovation activity. It's not a determinant, that's important, but it is a prerequisite, because it needs to be of a scale where you've got enough diversity as alongside a kind of a density of different organizations and activities, but yet still be a walkable, traversable and comprehensible place at a very human level. And I think the mix is really important, because it's a mix across sectors and scales of organizations, a mix of talents, a mix of skills base, a mix of ideas. That's all the sort of fuel that can help make stuff happen. And then I go back to the point that we were talking about before, about the need for test bed environments and a mentality, because often we need more rapid prototyping and iterative learning if we're going to get more radical innovation. But these sorts of things in that manageable human scale, where you've got established and strong networks of trust, where you've got increased visibility, where you've got the right density and where you've got the right proximity, they can help achieve more radical over incremental innovation in a place. And I think often if we focus on larger scale environments, we tend towards retrofitting or tweaking existing big infrastructure or systems, rather than allowing ourselves to do radical rethinking or disrupting systems. So, I mean, just exactly that, if we think in the UK about the energy market and the innovation that's happening there, a lot of that, if you compared where the innovation is happening through the national infrastructure like National Grid versus the different types of energy production and distribution happening at a district level, most of the radical innovation energy work is happening at that localized level through things like district energy networks or sand battery storage or battery recycling. So sometimes focusing at the larger scale risks limiting ourselves to incremental, not radical innovation. We need to see the city as a whole system and join up those connected parts, as I was talking about with things like the land and the planning uses, alongside education, skills and placemaking. and we need to sustain and refuel the innovation system to keep it thriving. And just as Tim was talking before, a big part of this is about diversity and inclusion, and how we understand and have a kind of equal focus on both inclusion systems and innovation systems, because the two are linked. And if we don't invest in our inclusive efforts, then the risk is that the innovation economy exacerbates the already apparent inequalities that we're really struggling with. So we need to be concerned not just with generating innovation-led growth, but the right type and the right distribution of that growth. Really asking ourselves, who gets to innovate and on what? I think Vienna, as Tim mentioned before, is an example that I would offer of a city that's tried to really understand its whole place contribution, and specifically looks to sustain that mix, that diversity of offer. And for that reason, it's won the most livable city on the Global Livability Index for the last few years running. And part of that is the way it invests in things like good and affordable public transport. It's €1 per day, as opposed to £5 per day in London to get from zones 1 to 3. It invests in cultural events and programming. So to the extent that the city subsidises independent cinemas and concerts and classical music performances. It has a real focus on its social housing policy. 60% of the population live in high quality social housing. So many more people can afford to live right in the city centre. And it has a very clear health and well-being focus, with facilities like public swimming pools that look grander than Bath's Roman baths, you know, and every new housing development is required to provide 50% of public green space alongside the housing. So they're just a few examples of something that Tim was raising before about the need to really understand an innovation economy in the whole place of the city, and to position it as part of an urban innovation opportunity, and to ensure that we really do fuel these innovation economies with a diverse mix of people, and we can sustain that mix by having the right composition of things like affordable housing, of things like accessible public transport, and of things like health and wellbeing facilities.
Emma, I'm feeling very persuaded by what you've just said. And if I was to summarize it in the most simple way I can, innovative cities need innovation districts, because the innovation districts give them the radical edge that they might not otherwise have. But innovation districts need innovative cities to give them the scale and the inclusiveness that they might otherwise miss. And it seems to me that what you've described is how those two things work together in this kind of magical symmetry that makes both of them richer than they would otherwise be. Tim, now with your 100 cities that you spend your time with around the world, what have you got to add to this question? Are innovation districts the answer, or is it innovative cities that we want?
Well, I think Emma has really covered a really key set of the dimensions of what it means to think through the relationships between the two. And I would observe that when we look around the world, it's actually increasingly important that innovation districts develop a very clear sense of what is the value add for the whole city. Otherwise, it begins to lose its social license to operate. And otherwise, city regions or their city or metropolitan governments might begin to think, actually, we need to start to think about a much more equalized approach that doesn't prioritize and risks diluting the innovation character that Emma, I think, has said is so important to have some place ingredients in. And therefore, innovation districts, I think, do need to work out how they reach in through workforce practices, through good coordinated governance, through many different sets of interventions and programs to the wider city. And I think one of the things that Emma is really alluding to is that we're about to go through a whole set of journeys in many cities around the world of governance innovation of how do cities, city, regional and metropolitan innovation leadership, how does that start to feed investment and programs to support the right locations with the right things? Secondly, how do those locations that have been served and unlocked by big capital, how do they begin to think, what is the way in which we can serve a wider city and develop more and fulfill more of our responsibilities to society and to the planet? And then I think, very interestingly, there's a whole host of ways in which different cities are thinking, can we turn our improvement districts, whether those are cultural improvement districts or other sorts of specialized location, how can we actually turn the collaborative, sort of accumulated collaborative spirit that we've already assembled and drive that towards a whole host of innovation activities that will make more places, I think, look and feel more like the kind of innovation districts that we hope for. So different governance models are going to emerge, and I suspect that actually this will be one of the key areas, getting the local and place-based governance right so that it can adapt to both the place and the wider city and the interface between the two.
Well, Tim, there's a very optimistic message in what you've just said, that if we focus on how to create the best innovation districts, we'll actually learn how to create the best urban districts overall. And there'll be, as it were, some dissemination and some spillover benefits from doing that for other kinds of districts. Now, I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you, if I may, just to ask you one more question, but I think it's short answers, please. So on this big agenda that we've been talking about, innovation economies, place, cities, citizens, inclusion, acceleration, visibility, what's the outlook for what's going to happen next, and where are we headed? Emma, a few points from you.
The things I draw out is that innovation districts are increasingly a core part of national and state strategies. And we can see that very explicitly in the UK. So, for example, what was the UK industrial strategy is morphed into the national innovation strategy. And then there's the distinct role of place-based innovation within the Levelling Up white paper too. So in fact, the first 16 pages of that talk about the Medici effect, which is essentially innovation districts. So it's actually quite core to the way that government is now thinking about doing really quite intensive economic development and levelling up regeneration agendas, as we were just discussing, the power of innovation economies to influence whole cities and wider regions in terms of their governance changes, but also in terms of what they can actually deliver for that whole city return. And I think that we've recognised the need for joined up networks of place-based innovation leads at that national level to act as a bridge between practitioners and policymakers. In fact, that was one of the core reasons that we set up the UK Innovations District Group, so that we could have that dialogue between different places, between different types of leaders, really focused on the practical delivery and doing of these innovation spaces, and have that directly inputting into new policy formation, because that's the way that we start to really test and refine the big governance shifts that Tim was alluding to us needing and seeing, in the next few years to come.
Thank you, Emma. So I've taken from that we've got to optimize the network effects between all of these places if we're really going to reap the benefits of it. And that's exactly what you're doing with the UK Innovation Districts Group. Tim, what about you? What do you see as being the outlook? What's next? Where are we headed?
I think we're headed, Greg, for a period of time when actually there's more than 100 innovation districts around the world that are reaching critical mass, reaching maturity. They've developed a really strong sense of place, of leadership, and of sustainable governance and sustainable finance as well, I think. Some of those districts, as we've sort of alluded to, might in a certain sense exit and become full spectrum districts, urban districts, and will have learned about how to do some of those other activities that only innovation districts are really purposefully focusing on. But I think there's going to be that core vanguard group of about 100 districts from which the next 1,000 will be learning from. I think there's going to be a big new emerging discipline about what is the nature of place leadership, place convening, and place governance in these sorts of special innovation-rich areas. And they will have to emerge and have to flourish from different origins, as we've discussed, different types of location everywhere. But actually, there are some common lessons, but also very customized ways in which that group of unique facilitators and intermediaries will start to develop real confidence about how their practice can succeed. And then I think we're getting into much more, how do innovation districts take the next step and become, develop their own sense of mature governance, we say, but also the kind of revenue models, the kind of financing models to do bigger ticket interventions and start to even work on behalf of other locations in their vicinity and beyond. I think there's a lot of ways in which that nexus, which we've just kind of been talking about the last 5 minutes, is fascinating. It's why we're so excited about what the next 10 years, I think, has ahead of us. Emma,
Tim, I just want to say a very big thank you. We we live in dark and troubling times, actually. But the light and the insight that you've both provided in this last 40 minutes on how place-based interventions and innovation economies are not just part of a special solution to a special problem, but are actually part of how we reinvent our world, reinvent our lives, and in the process reinvent our cities, I think has left me feeling very optimistic about the cycle ahead. And we're very grateful to you for joining us on World City. Thank you.